What's going on, guys? So today's tutorial is going to show you how to install the GameGear TV outboard into your GameGear. Just one quick note, guys, this install only covers the dual ASCII motherboards. I'll leave a link in the description to the single ASCII install diagram. The process is exactly the same, you just use different points. Alright, so the first thing we need here is a 40-watt soldering iron with a small chisel tip. After that, we'll just need some solder. We're also going to need a 10mm drill bit. We're also going to need a small Phillips head screwdriver, and depending on your console you may also need a number 8 game bit screwdriver. And lastly, we're just going to need the GameGear TV kit. You're also going to need 2 small switches. This last one is completely optional, that is some very thin shielded coax cable. You can usually get this stuff out of old laptops and things. It's used for Wi-Fi antennas. This isn't included in the GameGear TV kit, so you're going to have to source it yourself. Alright, so the first thing we need to do here is flip the console over and remove the 7 screws from the back. Depending on your console, these can either be Phillips head or game bit. Once you have all the screws removed, open the console from the bottom. Be mindful of the 3 cables going to the 2 daughter boards on the bottom half of the case. Disconnect all 3 of these cables from the 2 daughter boards and then pull the top of the case away. Using some double-sided tape or hot glue, fasten the GameGear TV board below the cartridge connector. Make sure it's the same orientation as this, as it will make the install much neater. Now go ahead and tin all the pads on the video outboard. You don't need a whole lot of solder for these pads, as the wires we're soldering to them are only very thin. Alright, so the first wire we're going to install in here is the ground wire. Solder one end to the ground tab on the GameGear TV board and the other end to the negative side of the capacitor closest to the second ASCII chip. The next wire we're going to install is the 5V wire, so solder one end to the 5V pad on the PCB. Then connect the other end of the wire to the positive leg on the capacitor that we just soldered ground to. Now take another piece of wire and solder it to the UR tab. Take the other end of your wire and solder it to the resistor located at R50. Now take a new piece of wire and solder it to the point CS on the video outboard. Now solder the other end of this wire to the point on the motherboard labelled T2. This next step is only if you're going to be using shielded coax cable. What we need to do is strip back the coax cable and solder a small piece of wire to the shielding on the outside. Then we're going to take the center wire from our coax cable and solder it to PC on the video outboard. Now we're going to take the extra piece of wire we soldered to the coax cable and simply just solder it to ground. Now simply solder the center wire of the other end of the coax cable in between resistors R13 and R14. If you aren't using coax cable, try and keep the PC line as far away from all the other wires on the motherboard as possible. Now solder another piece of wire to the point labelled HS on the video out PCB. Now solder the other end of the HS line to pin 46 on the first ASCII chip. This is located on the bottom side of the chip, 5 pins away from the second ASCII chip. Now solder a piece of wire to the point D3 on the video out PCB. Now solder the other end of D3 to the bottom side of the resistor located at R55. Now take another short piece of wire and solder it to the pad labelled D2. Now solder the end of the D2 line to the bottom side of the resistor located at R57. Now solder a short piece of wire to the pad labelled D1 on the video outboard. Now solder the other end of D1 to the bottom side of the resistor located at R54. Now take another small piece of wire and solder it to the pad labelled D0. Now solder D0 to the right hand side of the resistor located at R56. Now go ahead and drill a hole and install your multi-AV out jack into the bottom half of the case. Now if you want, you can use your AV breakout PCB to make things much easier to solder to. Simply line up the holes with the pins and then solder it in. Now we're going to solder a wire to the ground tab on the GameGear TV board. Then all we have to do is solder the ground wire to the point labelled ground on the breakout PCB for the video connector. Now take another piece of wire and solder it to the pad labelled 5 volts. And then you guessed it, solder it to the 5 volt tab on the breakout PCB. So basically all we have to do is match up all the points on the breakout PCB to all the pads on the video out PCB. If for whatever reason you're not using the breakout PCB, just take note of which pins you soldered which wires to. When you're done soldering all the wires to the breakout PCB, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. And now the last thing we need to do is install our 2 switches. For my unit, I'm actually going to hide the switches. One of them is going to be hidden underneath the batteries and the other one's going to be hidden underneath the battery door clip. You don't have to put your switches in the same location I have, you can put them wherever you want, but I like to keep mine nice and neat. Once you've chosen the location for your switches, mount them in and then solder 2 wires to each of them. Alright, so with the first switch, solder one of the wires to the pad labelled EN and the other wire to the pad labelled ground on the video out PCB. Now for the second switch, solder a wire to the point labelled T10 on the top right hand side of the motherboard. Now take the other wire on the second switch and solder it to 5 volts. Alrighty then, so the install's finished. Your install should look something like this. Hopefully your wires are a little bit neater than mine, but that shouldn't hurt anything. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Leave any questions or comments down below. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you on my next video. Bye! Hi guys, thanks for watching my video. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe, it really helps me out. Also, you can find me on Twitter and on my website. I'll put the links in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you in my next video.